So in this unit, you're going to be learning all about React.js, or React.js, or just React. They're kind of interchangeable terms. But first up, let's have a little bit of a brief overview of what React actually is. So in a nutshell, it's a library for creating web apps. Don't worry again if web apps isn't a term that is familiar to you. We'll go over that in the next slide. But a little bit of history about React. So it was first released in 2013, which means that it would either be in or on its way to going to high school now if it was a person. It was developed by Meta, or at the time they were just called Facebook. It was created by a guy called Jordan Walk, and he actually is still a staff engineer at Meta as far as I'm aware. Used to work for AWS and a bunch of other companies. But he kind of leads the development and the community of React.js. It's completely open source code under what's called an MIT license, which, I mean, there's a couple of things that you need to bear in mind, but ultimately it means that you can do whatever you want with it. You could sell it, you can use it for whatever you want, you can even edit the way that it works. It's written in JavaScript, which is great because we've already used a lot of JavaScript, and as we know, JavaScript is the only programming language that will work on the web, apart from HTML and CSS, of course, but that's another discussion. And ultimately, it is incredibly popular to use. And like we've said in a few of the other lessons here, popularity mostly means jobs, because if it's being used in lots of places, that means that there's people hiring for it. It's also used as kind of a framework for lots of other technologies such as Next.js and Gatsby as well, but a little bit more on that later. So we talked about web apps here. So what's the difference between a web app and a web site? Well, there's a little bit of an opinion around what makes it a web app and what makes something a web site. But generally speaking, if your website or web app is showing mainly static information such as a blog, or an example I've got here is a car owners club. You know, they're just giving out kind of news and updates and pictures and stuff like that that you access when you visit their website. It's mostly kind of static information. A web app, on the other hand, is completely sort of interactive and will have ever-changing data. So for example, here I've got my Strava homepage. If I go on another run, you know, I'll be able to upload that and I'll be able to analyze the data. You can see there's kind of data analysis on the left-hand side as well. So again, there is a little bit of a debate as to what constitutes a web app versus a website, but ultimately that's it. Is it quite interactive? If so, it's a web app. And if it's mostly static, information that just updates when kind of new stuff is put there, then it's probably a website. Again, this is absolutely up for discussion, and especially, you know, if you want to kind of get a bit more clarity on this, make sure that you bring it up in your one-to-ones, or just put a note into Slack and say, hey, I've found this website, what do we reckon? Is this a web app? Is this a website? Make sure that you're discussing this with your peers. So one of the great things about React is it's made up of lots of components. And actually not necessarily lots of components, it could just be a few components on your website. But the thing is, these components are just bits of UI. They're reusable bits of UI. So if we take the Amazon kind of page here that I've got open on the right hand side, just to some food stuffs here, you'll see that each one of these kind of product cards has real similarities about them. Okay, there's slight differences with the information that's given, but what it means is that the developers can create one kind of product card in React, and then just give it different data depending on what product they're trying to show in that list, which means that it really cuts down on your development time, because you kind of do something once and then you can kind of use that again and again and again. One of the great things about this is that components can also be nested, so you can have components inside components. So for example, this add to basket button here might be its own little component that does a bit of tracking or something like that, that sits inside the product card component. That's just an example. But what a component actually is, and we'll have a look at this in more detail in the next slide, is they're just functions, they're just JavaScript functions that return markup, or the M in HTML. Okay, so let's have a look at what these components or these functions actually look like. So these components are, like I said before, they're just functions. So in the example of the product card, also anyone outside of the UK might be thinking a steak and kidney pudding sounds absolutely disgusting. But in the UK, pudding is not the same as pudding in, say, America. I've put a link below actually if anyone's interested in what that actually means. Anyway, we're getting sidetracked. So let's actually have a look at our function here. Now you can see all we're doing here is we've got this product card function and we're returning from it a div component with a class name of product card. That's the whole card. And then inside it we have maybe a H3 with the title and a P with the star rating here, for example. Now this is a little bit basic. There would probably in reality be a lot more code going on here, but this just gives you an idea of what kind of goes into making one of these components. You'll notice as well that this looks strikingly like HTML, and yes, it is very, very similar to HTML. But in React, we call this JSX. One of the great things, like I mentioned before, is that we can reuse these components. So we make that single function, and then we can pass other data into it. So for example, let's say that we have gone off to our products API off at Amazon in their data centers, and we've got back this response which has got these two products that have to happen in a list. Okay, this is a bit hypothetical, but so we've got one product which is our steak and kidney pudding, and then we've also got another product that is our meatballs in tomato sauce. Now all of this data with all of the different stars that each of them has, the unit price, the price of the product, was price, how many there's in stock, we can then feed that dynamic data into our product cards or into those components. So if we just make a few little changes to our component, we can instead feed in that data. Now there would be a little bit more going on here, for example, to make the stars actually show the stars rather than just the number 4 and stuff like that. But this is essentially how we then pass in that data. We would pass it into our product card here, and we've just called this variable data here, this property or prop as data. And then we're handing that down into all of these little kind of bits of HTML here. So instead of us having to hard code the actual title of the product, we instead hand down this data. And we can do this in lots of different areas. We do this using curly brackets. No need to remember this off by heart right now. We will be practicing this a lot later. So we've created our kind of reusable component inside our app.js, or our kind of main product list maybe. What we can then do is we can feed the different data into each of those product cards. So for example, we've got response at index 0, which was that steak and kidney pudding data. And then we've also said, go ahead and render another product card, but instead put in the second element, that kind of response at index 1. So this is a really kind of good way of being able to just program one product card, and then we use the data to make sure that each kind of displayed bit of the user interface is then kind of displayed with the correct data. In reality, we'd probably do this in a loop. We'd loop over the array of products and we'd, do it that way. But this just kind of illustrates that we can use that product card function many times in our app and then feed in different data depending on, what it is that we want to display. You'll notice that we used this data word here. Well, if I just go back one slide, you'll see that we actually passed that in here, data. Okay, we'll get practicing that, so don't worry if that doesn't make too much sense right now. So there's one more kind of concept that I just want to sort of put a seed in your head before we go on. And that is something called state. Now, when we were creating our browser-based games, we often needed to remember the state of a game. So for example, if you were creating something where a sprite moved around the screen, you would have needed to have remembered where that sprite actually was located. Now, you could have just put this in a variable, right, called, sprite position. Or maybe you were building a tic-tac-toe game. You needed to have a variable somewhere that remembered the state of the game so that you could then check for win conditions, etc. Now, we can do something very similar in React. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as using just a variable. We can use variables to remember things, but if we want things to change dynamically on our web page, it's not quite as simple as that. But don't worry, we will be going into it in a lot more detail during this unit. One of the things that this is clever for, though, is that it means that the whole page doesn't re-render every time something changes. Okay, so let's go into that in a little bit more detail. What's this whole re-rendering thing? So what I've got here is I've got the Amazon web page that we just looked at. And there's two very slight differences. We've kind of got a before and an after. And the before here is on the left. And this is kind of before we've done an add to basket. Now on the second one, I've gone and added a steak and kidney pudding to my basket. And what that's meant is on the user interface, we needed to kind of update that one in basket. So an update has happened to our website, our web app in this case. Now, if you weren't using something like React, and yes, you can do this just in JavaScript, but kind of this is where React is really powerful. What it will do is instead of kind of re-rendering the entire web page and rebuilding it line by line just to make that one single change, it goes and updates only one component. So in this case, it will only update and re-render to the browser this one steak and kidney pudding product card. So again, don't worry if this doesn't make too much sense. What I'm trying to do here is just kind of put these seeds of how React might work for us and be kind of advantageous for us to use. Just kind of put them in your head so that they feel a little bit more familiar when we actually come to do this in kind of our real built app. Great, so what we'll do next is we'll actually start to build a React application. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be building a pizzeria application.